What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast. My name is Heath Brady, and I am your host.
My name is Andrea Brady, and I'm your co-host.
We're just a couple of wonderful Gen Xers doing everything we possibly can to give you our perspective on church culture. And this podcast is dedicated to the Gen X Christians out there.
You know, the ones who just want to keep it simple.
The ones who just want quiet, peaceable lives.
We represent the generation of Christians who sometimes looks at what others are doing and thinks, whatever. But as it says in 1 Timothy 1:5,
the goal of our instruction is love, from a pure heart, and from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. So, Andy.
So, Heath, what's going on?
You were trying to beat me to the punch there.
I was trying, but you're quick.
Quick draw McGraw over here.
All right.
How's it going?
Pretty good.
Just
Hanging
pretty
in
good?
there.
Hanging in there,
Yeah.
I watched this really, really dumb movie the other day.
Okay.
And I'm going to vent about it. Because, you know, there's this whole Marvel versus DC war that goes on all the time.
Yeah.
Like, which is the better comic books and which is the better movies and everything.
Yeah.
And I will be the first to admit that as a DC guy, which is what I am, and we know this, right?
Yeah, we know this.
As a DC guy, other than, like, the Dark Knight trilogy and the Snyder Cut, the MCU puts out way better movies than DC does. And the Batman was a good movie. I mean, I loved that movie. It was really, really good. It's probably the best DC movie that's been put out, like, in the theaters for quite some time, right?
Okay.
All that to say, I finally broke down, got on my Disney Plus, because there's a lot of Marvel stuff that's coming out, and I feel like I'm behind. Still haven't seen the new Doctor Strange movie. There's this movie called The Eternals.
Okay, I've never even heard of it.
Exactly. I haven't done really any research to determine whether or not the movie was a box office flop. But I watched it, and it was like one of the dumbest movies I've ever seen in my life.
Really?
Yeah. It's, you know, it's another one of those movies that has the potential of being something really, really incredible, and it turns out to be an absolute dud. I had like millions of questions throughout this entire movie, and I'm not even going to bore our listeners with going into details about this movie. If you have Disney Plus, or if you have a Redbox membership, you can watch it.
It only got 47% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, wow. That's pretty terrible.
Whatever that means.
That's pretty terrible, actually. That's pretty terrible.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
So, yeah, it was like these all different characters in the Marvel universe, and like there's no like real backstory to who these people are. They try to narrate through most of the movie, trying to explain like how these people became what they are and whatnot. But it's if you have like 2 hours of your life that you don't ever want to get back, wasted on watching the movie The Eternals. They should have just like never done it. In fact, I was talking to one of my youth group kids today.
Yeah.
I said that he came into my office and visited with me for like a brief second, and I told him that I finally broke down and watched The Eternals, and he was like, yeah, what did you think? And I said, it's one of the biggest pieces of garbage I ever watched in my life.
Yeah.
And he's a total like Marvel Comics, like that's his wheelhouse, right?
Yeah.
This kid's like 12, 13 years old. And he says to me, yeah, they should have just like stuck to the TV show. And I just kind of nodded and said, yeah, I went along with it. I have no idea what he's talking about. But, you know, for him to say anything when it comes to the MCU, I'm going to take it as like sage wisdom and knowledge. So, yeah, The Eternals, garbage movie. I'm embarrassed to admit that I watched it.
2 thumbs down.
Yeah, 2 thumbs and 8 fingers down.
Well, there's another 80s reference for you.
Oh, yeah?
The thumbs up or the thumbs down on the movies. I forget. What were those guys' names?
That was Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah, there you go.
The movie the movie critic guys.
That's right.
Big 2 thumbs down for me, Gene. It was Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, if I remember correctly.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. Anyways. Now that I got that out of the way, I have to tell you, Andy.
Yeah.
I greatly appreciate your willingness to come on our previous episode and be amazingly transparent and honest individual.
And share my testimony.
Share your testimony with everybody. The response has already been just amazing. And, I'm not surprised because everybody loves you. The Churchosity podcast would not exist if you ever went away.
Oh.
So you have very much job security here.
Okay, well, I'm not planning to go anywhere.
That's good because I'd be lost without you. But, I'm kind of regretting that I let you go first.
I knew you would.
Because I have to follow you. And you knocked it out of the park in our last episode.
Well, everybody's faith journey story is different.
That was very kind of you to put it that way. I will take that as a compliment.
It is.
So yes, ladies and gentlemen, listeners of Churchosity, on this episode we are going to continue the conversation of sharing our testimonies. And as you guessed it, on this episode, I guess that means that this is my life.
Yeah, this is your life.
Yeah, Heath Brady, this is your life. Well, a lot of things that I could talk about in my testimony, I have probably already shared a little bit here and there throughout the history of Churchosity. So, I don't want to be redundant and repeat a lot of stuff that I've talked about as far as my past and relationships with my parents and stuff like that. So you're probably going to hear a whole heck of a lot of other information about me and my life and my faith journey and my walk with Jesus that you probably never heard before. And some of you might be surprised. Some of you might not.
I'm wondering if I'm going to hear anything I haven't heard before.
Oh, because you think I got secrets?
I don't know. I'm not saying that. I mean, there were a few tidbits that I threw out there last week that you hadn't heard before.
That's true. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Well, we'll see. I don't know. It's not like I got anything like sneaky up my sleeve or anything. I'm just going to talk my talk. Well, so I grew up in a home that went to church pretty much every Sunday. I am reluctant to say that I grew up in a Christian home, but I will definitely say that I grew up in a home that went to church every Sunday. It was just what we did. My birth parents divorced virtually right after I was born, and my mother started dating my stepdad when I was pretty little. I think I was about like 8 months old or something like that. He raised me. So my stepdad was dad. And when I was like 4.5, 5 years old, something like that, he adopted me. So that's where I got my last name. So Brady is actually not my birth name, although it is on my birth certificate because he adopted me.
Yeah.
But like I said, we went to church. I grew up in the Salvation Army Church, and I don't really have a lot of fun memories about that. But what I can tell you is, having grown up in that church and remain in that church until I was in the 5th grade, I don't remember ever hearing the gospel.
Oh my, really? That's unusual.
It is. But it might also be because I don't remember the gospel ever making sense to me. And there's a little bit of theology involved in that I won't divert into, but it's quite possible that the gospel was preached, but I just never heard it because it didn't make any sense to me.
Interesting.
So when I was in the 5th grade, my parents decided that we were going to leave the Salvation Army Church. And of course, as I've shared before, my grandparents on my mother's side were like lifers in the Salvation Army Church. And when my family decided that we were leaving, my grandmother virtually cut us off for a couple of years
Oh.
because she believed that we had, quote, broken our vow with God.
Wow, that's really strict.
Yeah. So that was fun. So we ended up going to a denominational church. We went to a Nazarene church that was, walking distance from our house. And I was a part of that church from the 5th grade until about midway through my freshman year of high school. So about 4.5 years, we'll say. And there's a couple of folks that I went to church with there when I was part of the youth group that I'm still friends with to this day. So something good did come out of that. In fact, one of my closest friends from back then is still a very close friend of mine, and their entire family. Their mom is like a second mom to me. She always has been. So shout out to you, Linda, if you're listening.
That's sweet.
Yeah, she's the greatest. But what's interesting about Linda and my relationship with Linda is that when I was like in the 5th or 6th grade, Linda was the head admin person at that Nazarene church at the time. And I think it was, I don't remember why I was at the church that day, because I don't think it was a Sunday and I don't think it was youth group night. But she came walking up to me and she said, "Heath Brady, I had a dream about you last night, only you were an adult. And you were standing behind a pulpit preaching to a room full of people." And I don't know what that means, but it's kind of an amazing dream that I had, and I wanted you to know that I think you're supposed to be a pastor someday.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, dumb little Heath Brady was like, whatever,
Yeah.
Is there any Hershey's bars up in the office?
Well, it made an impression on you because you remembered it.
Yeah, it's certainly. I've never forgotten that. It certainly did, and like I said, Linda was like a second mom to me. So it was kind of prophetic, at the risk of sounding charismatic, And I blew it off because I was a kid, but at the same time, like you said, I never stopped thinking about that. Now, what's interesting is that when I was in the 3rd and 4th grade, I went to a private Christian school, and periodically I chose to get up in front of the entire school at chapel and preach exegetically, which I didn't know I was doing at the time, obviously, but preach exegetically through passages of Scripture for chapel.
Really?
And it would afford me like certain benefits at the school, like I wouldn't have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and I got 5 extra minutes. I got to go out 5 minutes early for recess, stuff like that. So priorities, right?
Right.
But at a very, very young age, especially even younger when I was in the Salvation Army, when I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, every year at Christmas time, I would go with my grandparents down to the place where my grandfather worked. And I would, and the place where my grandmother volunteered, and I would recite 'Twas the Night Before Christmas every year.
Oh.
So like the whole concept of getting up in front of people and talking, I've just kind of always been a natural. Not afraid to be in front of a room full of people and talk about something.
Interesting.
So,
yeah.
So then fast forward, Linda has this dream. She comes and tells me about it, and it's like, on the one hand, yeah, I'm a child, whatever, because my idea of a pastor was like somebody who was old, and stuffy, and wore, very uncomfortable suits and sweat a lot when they talked, because that's all that I had ever seen.
Right.
Well, anyways, so by the time I was a freshman in high school, my mom and stepdad had gone through quite the roller coaster of a marriage, and they were separated and then back together, and then separated and then back together. And so at one point they were separated for quite a long time, and my mother left the Nazarene church and started going to a non-denominational church. And my stepdad decided, mostly out of spite, to stay at the Nazarene church, which is where I kept going until I bumped into a friend of mine whose neighbor across the street from their house invited me to this youth group.
Okay.
And this youth group was at the church that I ended up going to for like ever.
Oh, so that's the youth group that I started going to so I could see you.
Yes.
Got it.
That's that youth group. Mm-hmm. And that friend of ours, that friend who invited me, is someone that you went to high school with.
Right, I know.
Yes, so you know who I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So I started going to that youth group in my freshman year of high school and became real tight with the youth pastor. And to this very day, he's a pillar in my life. And if I ever needed anything from him, whether it's as a friend, as a brother, or as a pastor, he would make time for me. He's just a wonderful, wonderful guy. Now, where it gets really interesting, kind of like, in Back to the Future Part 2, the alternate 1985, Andy, you and I had made a connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, we for those who don't remember or don't know, Andrea and I grew up in the same neighborhood, about 7.5 blocks from each other, and went to the same preschool when we were like 3. Probably played at the same park together our entire childhood. In fact, I think we have determined that we had.
Yeah.
But officially met at the Boys and Girls Club when we were 11.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I met you.
And I come strolling through the front door.
Yeah, well, like, I'm 11, so, like, I haven't discovered girls. Like, I still believe in girl germs at this point, right? But I was over at the carpet ball table, and you came walking over to the carpet ball table and just started talking to me. Mm-hmm. And girls don't really do that. Well, at least back then, girls didn't really do that. But I will never forget looking at your eyes.
Yeah.
And just being like, oh my gosh, that's an angel.
Oh.
Like, and that's what I call you to this day. You're my angel, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody else gets to call you that.
No, nobody.
Yeah. But I just, we made this like instant connection. And for years, you and I would go on to develop a really incredibly tight and beautiful friendship. Mm-hmm. We would hang out together all of the time. We would go to the store together. We would play video games. And on a few occasions, you were over at my house. I was playing the drums for you. We were listening to records together.
Yeah.
We would go to Green Lake, which was, the big lake in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And this one particular summer, you and I were at Green Lake, and we wrestled in the water.
Yeah.
And it's part of your story, but I'm going to say it. You've always told me that day there was this light switch in your heart that turned on.
Yeah.
Where you just knew that we had a connection that was more than just friends. Mm-hmm. I, on the other hand, had known that all along from the day that I met you, but I didn't know how to describe it because, again, I was 11 and then I was 12. And, by the time this event occurred, I think we were 13.
Yeah, we were 13.
And I really, 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 really liked you, Andy. Like, a lot. Mm-hmm. But there was just one problem. You were dating my best friend.
Right.
And for the guys out there in listener land, you know what I'm talking about when I refer to something known as the bro code. You were untouchable. I mean, I could hang out with you. We could go places together, but nothing romantic was ever going to happen between the two of us. And so I kept it to myself.
Okay.
And then I remember when we were 15, I was walking you home from youth group like I usually did. And we were walking through our park in Seattle, and I said to you, Andrea, I finally got up the courage and the gumption to say something. And I said, Andrea, I really like you a lot, but you're somebody else's girl. And in your infinite wisdom, you said...
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Right. Well...
Wah, wah, wah.
The way that you said it, and the way that it sounded to me, was like you were telling me that I was damaged goods. Like you just said a minute ago, I'm off limits for like ever. Uh-huh. And that's the impression that I got from your statement.
Yeah.
It wasn't sounding like drop that zero, get with this hero.
Which is what I should have said.
It was, hey, you're Jason's girl. I like you, but too bad.
Yeah.
And so I said nothing because I was like, what the heck? You know.
Do you folks hear the stern animosity in her voice as we talk about this, even all these years later?
I'm setting the record straight.
As you can tell, it's still a sore subject in our marriage. Not really. We like to tease each other about it.
Yeah.
It's all good now.
It's really just a misunderstanding.
It really is. And, maybe at some point in the not too distant future, we'll talk about the way that men and women are and how it's different. So anyhow, you and I did that whole cat and mouse thing for so many years.
We really did. It was crazy.
Like we both knew that there was this thing between us. We just knew. We didn't know what to call it. We didn't know how to describe it. We didn't even know how to say it to each other. But the reality always was that whenever the two of us got together, it was like we were in this bubble. And it was cool and it was great. And nothing romantic ever happened. It was just you and me till the wheels fall off kind of a thing, right? Yeah. And then and so in the background, my relationship with the Lord starts when I'm 14. It was July 15th, 1986. I went to an adult retreat with that church that I was going to, and the youth pastor convinced me that I should go on that retreat, even though it was for grown-ups. He convinced me that I should go. Mm-hmm. And so I went, and to make a long story extremely short, I heard the gospel, and it made sense to me that day. Mm-hmm. And I wanted Jesus to rule my life. And so in that moment, they were having a baptism at the lake at this retreat, and they finished baptizing all of the people who were scheduled to be baptized. And then the pastors opened it up to anybody else who wanted to be baptized, and I was the first one. I jumped up, ran into the water, and said, I believe, I want to be saved. Jesus is my Savior, and I want to be baptized.
Wow.
And it was immediate. And I was 14 years old, and I've never forgotten that. So last year was my 35th birthday as a Christian.
Wow.
Yeah. I wish that I could say, like you, that I fell in love with Jesus and wanted to know more about him when I was 8, but I didn't. So yeah, my conversion experience, for lack of a better term, happened when I was 14. And so all throughout high school, I was part of this non-denominational church, and there were a lot of things that I was seeing and hearing as it pertained to Christianity that didn't make a lot of sense. There were things about the faith at the time that really didn't add up for me.
Were these things that you were seeing and hearing in the church, or were they things that you were reading in the Bible, or what?
A little of both. It was mostly what it was that things were being taught that I would literally be looking at the passage of Scripture that was being taught on and thinking, that's not what this says.
Interesting.
This doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And not to slam or put down any kind of denomination or biblical worldview or anything, but these people were very dispensational. Again, a term that I would not learn for another 10 to 15 years, but looking back, what it was they were very dispensational. So and we've talked about this on a previous episode, that there's this model of dispensationalism, and this church followed it to the T. And there were all of these gaps. There were all of these holes. There were, the biggest thing that bothered me, Andy, was the possibility that I could ever lose my salvation.
Oh, gee.
That always bothered me. And do you want to know why it always bothered me?
Why?
Because I never did anything to gain it in the first place.
Right.
And so at the ripe old age of 14 years old, I'm already determining in my brain that that's got to be bad doctrine. Because I didn't do anything to deserve being saved. I didn't do anything to earn my salvation. That's Ephesians 2:8-9. So how in the world could I lose something that I never earned in the first place? It was given to me.
Yeah.
And what kind of a God would give me salvation only to kind of hold it over my head and then take it away because he's not pleased with me?
Huh.
Because I would argue that prior to salvation, he would have been a heck of a lot more displeased with me than after salvation.
Right.
Because of how I was trying to live my life. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so that just kind of always bothered me. But, you know, you don't want to stir up trouble. You don't want to cause problems. You just kind of, you know, I'm a Gen Xer. I just want to keep my head down, keep going forward.
Plus, you're just a kid.
And I'm just a kid, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, this sounds like a Quentin Tarantino film because I'm bouncing back and forth between two different timelines here because it's important to the story. All the while, you and I are going to youth group together, Andy.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's all of these connections, all of these ways that you and I are connected and whatnot, and nothing's happening and nothing's going on. I remember my sophomore year of high school, my mother and stepdad got back together again, and we moved.
Oh, that's right. That's when you moved out of the neighborhood.
And it was so devastating because like I wasn't really going to miss anybody from the old neighborhood except you. And the only way that you and I would ever get to see each other was at youth group. So of course I went every week.
Almost.
Almost. That's true. That's fair. And then, you know, on a couple of occasions, I remember at least one occasion while I was not living in Seattle, we bumped into each other at the mall. Mm-hmm. And, you know, nothing ever came of it. And I ended up moving back to Seattle. You and I ended up going to different high schools. But we would always cross paths. But nothing would ever come of that. And so as I've probably mentioned before, my mother put me ahead in school. So I actually graduated a year before I should have. I graduated barely 17. And you and I are 3 months apart in age. So you are a class behind me.
Yeah.
So I graduated a year before you did and moved out on my own and had an apartment with a buddy of mine and wasn't doing anything with my life, but I was in a band. Played drums, sang backup, whatever. And when I was 18 years old, I was at the University of Washington. And who do I bump into?
Me.
You. With your new boyfriend.
Yeah.
We were just talking about this the other day, too. And how much it still just hits hard. Because that was the day that you and I talked, and I looked at you and I said, you are always somebody else's girl. Mm-hmm. And that was the last time I would see you for 19 years. Mm-hmm. And that's when things started to really take a turn in my life in a dark way. I turned into this really... And not because it's your fault. I just now realize how horrible that sounds. It's all your fault that I screwed up my life.
I'm just one small component in all of this.
So I determined that you and I were not ever going to be together. And I was mad at God about that. As ridiculous as that sounds, I was mad at God about that. And so I became this just dark, you know, angry guy. I started to get angry at everything. Nobody wanted to be around me. I went into a really dark place. And it didn't help that I was barely 18 years old living on my own with one of my roommates was 21 and the other roommate was 20. And you can just imagine the kind of trouble that the three of us would get into under those circumstances. So fast forward several months later, and I ended up meeting a girl, and to make a very long, depressing story extremely short, her and I ended up getting married, and her and I were married for a long time. While that marriage didn't last and ended with divorce. Through that whole experience, there were 3 beautiful byproducts, and that's my 3 kids. And they're all adults now, which is really, really weird. My oldest is 30.
Wow.
That just makes me feel so old.
Yeah.
So, that was tough. I mean, it was many, many years of just being angry and bitter on the inside. And ironically, not only going to church every Sunday, but becoming a pastor. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you can picture that, but just full of all this angst and bitterness and just mad at the world and like numbing it by coaching sports and basically being married to the ministry. That's what my life was like for a very, very long time. And it took a lot of intervention and, massive wake-up calls. And eventually, my first wife and I got divorced. And, that was tough. It was tough to go through that. It was tough to come out of that level-headed. It's like mourning a death. I mean, it really felt like that. And I started drinking a lot, drank a lot. I would drink myself to sleep every night. And I lived with my brother at the time. I rented a room in his house.
So during this time, where was Jesus in your life?
I felt like Jesus had abandoned me. I felt like he hadn't been a man of his word. I felt like I put him in the same category as I put every boss that I had, every relative that I had, including my birth father, just everybody, that they were a bunch of empty promise makers, that they would say one thing and do another. And that's the way that I thought Jesus was with me. I thought that I was doing all of the right things. I thought that I was doing what would make Jesus happy because I got married really, really young. I was a faithful husband. I did the best that I could to raise my kids. I grew them up in the church. Mm-hmm. I even started going to seminary because I was so serious about being a pastor. And yet, I felt so disconnected from Jesus. And little did I know, it actually took one of my favorite professors from seminary to hit me upside of the head and realize that I had been living a works-oriented religion.
Yeah.
And that's why I felt so far away from Jesus. Have you ever heard of the story of the captain of a ship who they were sailing at night and he wasn't paying attention and he accidentally bumped the steering wheel and it knocked the ship off course just 1 degree?
Okay, yeah, I've heard about that.
So he goes to bed. He's got the ship on cruise control and he goes to sleep. And when he wakes up the next day, he's 300 miles off course.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
All from bumping the steering wheel just 1 degree.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that is that as much as I wanted to believe that Jesus had abandoned me, I bumped the steering wheel of my life 1 degree when I was 19 years old. And several years later, Jesus is still where he always has been, waiting for me to come back to him. He never went anywhere. It was I who had gone away. And so it took those words from my professor. He told that story, and he talked about how that's a works-oriented religion. That is not Christianity. Christianity is not religion. Christianity is a relationship with your Creator.
Right.
Christianity is a relationship, personal, one-on-one relationship with your Savior. And I'd never, ever heard it that way before. And it took my professor, it took my divorce, and it took my drinking myself into an oblivion for me to get all of that. My brother was worried about me. And one day when I was gone at work, he snuck in my room and stole all my liquor. A little intervention,
Yeah.
God bless him. It took a couple of days for me to get over my extreme anger with him for doing that, to finally wake up and realize that my life is a mess and I'm going nowhere fast except out of control. And so I did what I swore I never would do. I picked up the phone and I called a Christian counselor.
Ooh.
Because all of my life I believed that those two words were an oxymoron. That it was impossible to have, quote, Christian counseling because it would be biased, right? Yeah. It wouldn't be like authentic, neutral party counseling.
I know a little bit more about the story that I want to add.
Okay.
Because God's fingerprints were all over this. It wasn't that you went looking for a Christian counselor. You opened up your medical benefits.
Oh, yes.
And looked to see who in the network you were able to go.
Yeah, who my insurance would cover,
what counselors you could go to. And it just so happened that, like, one of the first ones that popped up.
It was the first one on the top of the list.
Yeah, and he ended up being a Christian counselor.
Yeah. And as reluctant as I was, I thought, well, it can't be any worse than where I'm at now.
Right.
And so I went. And that man was amazing. From the very first moment. My experience with that counselor, like, I wish everybody could see that guy.
Yeah.
He was amazing.
Yeah, he's really good.
So I met with him regularly and, talked about a lot of things in my life. Talked about my childhood, talked about my relationship with my mother, talked about my relationship with my father, talked about my divorce, talked about my kid. Like, we talked about all of it. We never talked about anything that had to do with religion. He never once cracked his Bible open. He never once asked if he could pray for me. But I knew he was a Christian counselor. Like, he was a pastor. And after several months of meeting with him before I left his office on this one particular day, I asked him if he would pray for me. And man, it was just so great. But I had that whole process was me course correcting the ship of my life to get back to Jesus. And it took me that long to find him. And I know that we like to say that Jesus is the good shepherd, because he is, and that Jesus will leave the 99 to come find the one. He called me back.
Yeah.
And I can't explain it to you other than, Jesus says he is the bread of life, and that no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. And the bottom line is that the Father drew me back to his Son. And since that day, I have never left his side.
Right.
And part of that is because, my theology has gotten better and my doctrine has gotten better and my seminary education has continued, and, and so the person that I was all those years ago, that guy doesn't exist anymore, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right. So,
in the midst of all of that, one of my younger brothers says to me, "Hey, Heath, you know what you should do? You should get on that Facebook thing. And you should see if you can find any of your old friends and, get out and start hanging out with people again." And this is back like in the earlier days of Facebook, when you could literally search for people by the school and the class.
Yeah.
And I went to 3 different high schools, and I was the class of 89. And so I looked up all of my friends and started friend requesting them like crazy. But then I remembered that the first school that I went to as a freshman and part of my sophomore year, that I knew a lot of the people who were class of 90 because I was there for my sophomore year. So I tweaked it. I tweaked the class from 89 to 90 and hit search, and poof, the first name that pops up is you.
Seriously,
Andrea.
Me.
His first name that pops up.
Oh my gosh.
And so I sent you a friend request. Now, mind you, I hadn't seen or heard from you in 19 years at this point.
Yeah.
And I sent you a friend request on Facebook with a little note, hey, do you remember me? And, within 5 minutes, we're friends and we're chatting and, playing catch up, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you and I reconnected on Facebook and went out for coffee one day.
Yep.
And that day was really an interesting day because I was hiding behind my sunglasses and talking about nothing really important. And I remember walking you back to your car, and you said to me, Heath, what if you and I were always supposed to be together?
Oh boy.
And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And I looked down at my watch and I'm like, but I've got a bunch of errands that I need to go run. And you got so mad at me.
I did. I said a bad word.
You said, we are going to sit down and we are going to talk about this right now.
That's right.
And you grabbed my arm and you pulled me over to this picnic bench and you sat me down and we talked about it.
Right. I mean, you're not just going to friend request me, message me, invite me out for coffee, and then pull that on me. I'm like, oh, no.
You just made me sound like a total player.
Yeah.
Because I'm not.
Well, and at that point in my life, I didn't want to mess around with this. It took forever for me to finally tell you how I felt about you. Yeah. I wasn't going to waste any time.
That's true. I mean, we weren't getting any younger either.
Yeah, I was just very frank and cut to the chase and,
Yep. So we decided after some time that we were going to try and date. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of fun, hanging out with you again and going places again. And but then there was our kids.
Right.
We had these 5 children between the two of us. And it was kind of this thing that was out there in space. And I will never forget, we laid out this plan that we were going to date for a certain period of time, and if it was working out, then we were going to introduce each other's kids to one another.
Yeah.
And
we didn't go according to plan.
No, we didn't. We did what we like to call, we hit the fast forward button.
Yeah.
Because we ended up meeting each other's kids pretty early, pretty fast. Mm-hmm. And everything just clicked. And I know that for a lot of folks who get remarried when there's kids involved, that the blending aspect of it can be really, really difficult because of all of the other factors that are involved there. But it seemed like, at least from my perspective, Andy, it seemed like that was the easiest part. Because the kids all just took a natural liking to each other. Mm-hmm. It was pretty great. My youngest and your 2 girls have been tight from day one. We call them the gruesome threesome. And he has just been the best big brother to both of the girls all these years. And, it was really, really neat to see signs of the Lord's redemptive work in my life. Because as I've mentioned before, I think it's in Genesis chapter 50 that says that what the devil intended for harm, the Lord has worked for good. And with everything that was going on in my life and in your life at that period of time for the both of us, Andy, the Lord's fingerprints were all over our relationship and our families. And on top of that, the fact that we had always known each other, since 11 years old.
Yeah.
And the fact that we had always known there was this connection between the two of us.
Yeah.
And the fact that we knew that we liked each other. I wouldn't say that it was simple, but it wasn't hard at the same time.
That's right.
So we got engaged, and I won't share that whole story. It's a fun story, but it takes a long time to tell. But we had a beautiful engagement. The 3 youngest kids were involved with the engagement, and everybody was excited. believe it or not, I'm still an old-fashioned guy. So, I asked for your mother's permission to marry you, and I asked for the kids' permission to marry you, and everybody said yes. I think your mother's exact words were, well, duh.
That was what she said.
And not in a derogatory or demeaning way, but that it was obvious that you and I should be together. But I remember, Andy, before we got engaged even, we were having conversations about what we were going to do about church, and what we were going to do about raising the kids as far as religion and all those things. Like all of those conversations that you have, we talked about this already.
Yeah.
That it gets a little dicey at times, right? Because on your side of the equation there was the whole Catholic thing, and on my side of the equation there was not. But take a trip back in time with me again a little bit. When I was in my mid-20s, I ended up working with a guy who was a very, very devout Roman Catholic. And we developed a really great friendship over time. And for years, and I mean years, he begged me to come to a Christmas Eve Mass with him every single year. Hey, Heath, you going to come to Mass with me? No. All right, maybe next year. For years. And I don't remember how many years it was, but it could have been like 10. I don't know. It seems like that. Maybe it was only 3. I don't know. But it was not it was not easy for him to convince me. And a lot of that was because of my, quote, religious upbringing, that Catholicism was evil. And I should have nothing to do with it. So finally, one year he convinced me. So I said, fine, I'll go. And I went. And I got to tell you, it's the most beautiful Christmas Eve service I think I've ever been to in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of regalia, and there's a lot of symbolism, and there's a lot of, my father would call it the religious gymnastics, where you're stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. But it was a beautiful service. But the thing that struck me the most in the Mass was the reverence for Scripture. That when the priest, when the father got up there to read from the gospel, he went through his whole little routine with the incense and everything, and then everybody stands while he reads it. And you can look at that in so many different ways. The way I looked at that was, there's something special in this church when it comes to the reverence for the red letters in the Bible. And that appealed to me. Now, let's go back. So you and I are working on blending. We're working on, we're trying out different churches because we're trying to find a place where everybody's going to feel comfortable. And plus, as you mentioned already, Andy, when you're divorced and remarried in most evangelical churches, you've got the scarlet letter on you. Pretty
much. I have to say that there's probably a ton of episodes that you could do about this topic.
For sure.
And I think that it's really sad that a lot of people who love the Lord are not loved by his people just because of their divorce and things that have happened in their past. They're judged and they feel like they have no future. They have no ministry. They have no opportunity. They have no hope in church. And I think that that's a horrible injustice. It's really sad.
Yeah, for sure. And when I say that we were trying to find a church that we would be comfortable in, it wasn't so that we could hide. It was so that we could be loved.
Exactly.
Because, it really wasn't going to take anybody rocket science to figure out that we were a blended family. It was just a matter of, what are they going to do when they do find out? You know what I mean?
Right.
So, remember how I had mentioned early on in my Christian faith, early on in my walk when I was a teenager, how there were all of these gaps, there were all of these holes, there were things that didn't make sense. In my early 30s, I was introduced to what is commonly referred to as Reformed theology. And that has to do with things like Calvinism, covenantalism, and confession. And all of those things made sense. They lined up with Scripture. Everything just fit. But not really everything.
Okay.
I still had some holes. I still had some gaps. And a lot of those holes and gaps had to do with what takes place during a Lord's Day service. it bothered me the way that most evangelical Christians treated the sacrament of the Eucharist or communion. It bothered me the way that most evangelicals that I had run with up to that point in my life, the way that they treated the sacrament of baptism. They were just kind of these things that you do. There wasn't really anything special about it. Huh. And not to drift off into the weeds, but it has always bothered me when a communion meditation has been given before we take communion, where we have to sit there and take a moment of silence and get ourselves cleaned up before God before we can even take communion, and then misappropriate 1 Corinthians 15, where the Apostle Paul says that anyone who eats of the bread or drinks the cup in an unworthy manner is cursed. Because that's not what Paul's even talking about there. And I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to drift off into the weeds about that. We're not going to have a Bible study about that. But it's wrong. It's a wrong appropriation and a wrong interpretation of what Paul's even saying there.
Interesting. Okay.
So anyhow, I decided, because on the one hand, I had all of these holes. But on the other hand, I had this exposure to Catholicism that I was curious about. And because your girls were going to Catholic school and we were going to Mass every once in a while, I thought, how cool would it be, if possible, if wherever we go to church, whether it's a Catholic church or a Protestant church, we can take communion as a family. And so I decided that I was going to go through Catholic faith formation. Now, just as a side note, I never did become Catholic. I never was baptized Catholic. I never was confirmed Catholic. I never even went to Catholic confession. But I could right now if I wanted to. I'm just saying. But what I learned, what I found in that Catholic faith formation course filled all of those gaps and holes that I had. And I have a really great understanding for all of the symbolism, all of the regalia, all of it that takes place in the Mass. It's fascinating to me.
Well, it's good that you got educated, too. I mean, it's much better if you're going to go to Mass occasionally. And the fact that the girls were raised Catholic, super helpful.
Exactly.
To know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember one time visiting the girls at school for their Mass, and it was during Holy Week, I think, and they were doing the Stations of the Cross, and I had never been before. Yeah. And I remember our second to the youngest, I think she was in the 5th grade at the time, their class was leading the stations. Oh yeah. At that Mass, and she helped me figure out which way I was supposed to face. Remember her class? They were up on the risers, up in front of the church, and we were like halfway to the back. And I stood up, and I'm a tall guy, so like I stick out like a sore thumb. She spotted me, and she was like nudging her head and like looking with her eyes, like there's where you start, Heathy. That's where you start,
That's so cute.
And it was just the sweetest thing, right? So anyway, what that Catholic faith formation did for me in filling in those gaps and plugging those holes in my Christian faith completely changed, even to this very day, how I approach a Lord's Day worship service as a Christian, as a worshiper of my King, of my Lord, of my Savior. And there's 100 examples that I could give you, but I'm going to give you one. The first day that I went to faith formation, the gal who was taking me through the course, she took me into the chapel, and we walked in, and she asked me, do you know why whenever Catholics enter the sanctuary or walk across the center aisle or excuse themselves from the sanctuary, they do the sign of the cross? Did you know? Well, I thought I did because, I've got the seminary education and I know my Bible. So I'm like, well, it's because they're admiring the crucifix that's hanging up there above the altar. They're paying respect to the Jesus on the cross up there. And I was kind of being snarky.
Right. A lot of people think that.
And she said, no, that's not why. And I was like, oh, then I have no idea. And she said to me, back in the days of the kings, if you were a king and you wanted to go visit or pay homage with or have counsel with the neighboring king, and you showed up to his castle or to his palace and entered into his throne room, what would you do the moment you walked into that room? And it hit me like a ton of bricks in that moment. I said, you would kneel and bow your head. And she said, why would you do that? And I said, because you'd be acknowledging that you're on that king's turf. And I got it. And it's I'm getting emotional about it even right now. And this happened so many years ago. When we go to church on Sunday, we are in the Lord's house, and he's waiting for us to come worship him. And I will never forget that. And I remember leaving class and that was just the first day.
Yeah.
I remember leaving class that day thinking to myself, you know what? The Protestants could learn a thing or two from the Catholics.
Yeah, a thing or two.
Because we don't act like that when we go to church. That's what I was thinking. We don't have that attitude. We're more concerned with, and this is the attitude that I had for years, that I'm going to go to church and the songs better be good and the sermon better be good and so better not try to bother me and so better pay attention to me.
Yeah.
You know, we go to church on Sunday and it's all about me.
What's church going to do for me?
Yeah.
Got it.
So anyhow, you know, there's a lot to our story, Andy. There's a lot to my faith journey that coincides with a lot of things that you already discussed on the previous episode. But, you know, the bottom line is that from the moment you and I got married, it's just been so wonderful to be with someone who gets it and who is just like me. You know, I love Jesus. I love Jesus. Not like a crazy person, but I love Jesus. And I love telling people about him. And I love the ministry. I love the people of God. I love his church. I love the ministry. I love everything about it. And doing life as a believer with you, Andy, is so wonderful because you're exactly the same. So along this journey of our marriage and our blending of our families, I had one of the greatest joys. And my heart became completely full when I got to adopt Emma and Audrey. And I became #Daddy of 5. Even the girls would tell you, we didn't need a piece of paper to say that we were a family. We didn't need a piece of paper to say that, you know, I'm their dad. But I now have a piece of paper to be able to tell everybody, these kids are mine.
Yeah.
And they always will be. And, you know, they call me Papa, which sometimes I miss Heathy, you know, because it was cute.
Yeah.
But I love being Papa. And the Jew in me really loves being called Papa.
Right.
But, you know, it's been an incredible journey. And one, I think, for me, my life is a picture of the redemption story. And it's not that I have it all figured out. It's certainly not that I've arrived. I've been on a roller coaster ride with Jesus my entire life. You know, I'm 50 years old now, and I still have a lot to learn. I still have a lot farther to go.
Right.
But as Paul wrote, I press on to the upward goal. The bottom line is this, listeners. What I think about now is the fact that my life expectancy, I've only got 22 years left on this earth. As morbid as that sounds. I want to live to be 100. But turning 50, like my body hurts like it never used to. I'm tired like I never used to be. I think about the reality that I'm going to be with my Savior someday soon. And there are two things that he could say to me when I meet him. And one of them I want to hear, and the other one I don't want to hear. The one that I don't want to hear is, "Depart from me, I never knew you." The one that I do want to hear is, "Enter in, my good and faithful servant."
Wow, that's deep. I know. And I know that since you've turned 50, you've also said that you want to be about the Lord's business.
All the time.
And we make it our business not to get distracted.
Yep.
And
the devil sure tries to render us ineffective.
Yeah. And we talk about that a lot.
Yep.
And how, we're on a good path. We're about the Lord's business, and whammo. Distraction. Yeah. But we press on, and continue about the Lord's business.
Yeah. There are many times in my life where it's almost miraculous that I am alive.
Yeah.
And at 50, looking back at those times in my past, not only is it miraculous that I'm still alive, but I'm thankful that the Lord didn't take me, because at the end of my life, people are going to say whatever they're going to say. But I want to make for darn sure that nobody can say that I didn't love Jesus, and nobody can say that I didn't love my wife, and nobody can say that I didn't love my kids. Mm-hmm. If there's one thing that everybody's going to be able to say about Heath Brady, so much as I have any say in the matter,
right,
it's that Heath loved his wife, Heath loved the people of God, and Heath loved his kids.
Mm-hmm.
And not because I'm so great and not because I'm so awesome, but because Jesus is, even though I'm not. Mm-hmm. And I am walking, talking, living, breathing proof that God can save anybody. God can take anybody's life and flip it upside down and turn them into a vessel of his goodness and his grace and his mercy.
Amen.
And that brings us to this week's proof that we're living in the last days. All right, Andy.
Yeah.
You've been patiently waiting.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling, because you're a little giddy, I have a feeling.
I am not giddy.
Yes, you are. Folks, if you were sitting here in the office with me right now, you would be able to testify to the giddiness of my wife. I have a feeling that whatever this week's proof is something good.
It's a little naughty.
What? Remember, we're a family show. I don't want to have to click. I don't want to have to click that little box when I upload the episode.
All right. So, my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, I want to set you all on the right path.
Oh, preach it to us, sister. Should we get some organ music playing? Some good Sunday worship tunes going?
So I learned something this week, and I almost died of being mortified. I was so embarrassed.
Oh, no.
So it was like the end of the world for me. Because for all these years, I've been saying something incorrectly. So I love pasta, and
I married an Italian woman, y'all. She loves her pasta.
Right? So all these years I've been calling it penne pasta.
You've been calling it what?
Penne pasta.
Yeah, that's your favorite. Put a little pesto on there.
That's not the right way to say it. You don't say penne pasta. It's not penne pasta.
It's not penne pasta?
No. It's penne. Penne. There's two N's.
Oh, the old Italian pronunciation, because there's two of the same consonant, so it's a long consonant.
It's very, very important to say it that way, because if you don't say it that way, you're saying something else in Italian. Something that you probably don't want to be saying.
Which is?
I don't know if I want to say it.
Well, everybody's curious, including me.
The word for male genitalia.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So every time you're at a restaurant and you order the penne pasta, you're not really saying penne pasta. It's supposed to be penne. So remember to put that second N in there. because I was mortified. I was so embarrassed.
Oh my goodness.
All these years. And I'm part Italian, and I took Italian in college, and I pride myself on saying things properly, but I just, I've been saying it the Americanized way all these years, but that means something completely different.
I was going to say, we Italian Americans, man, we just screw everything up. Because you know what? Now, whenever I look at a menu in an Italian restaurant, I'm never going to be able to unsee that now.
Well, you can thank me, because I don't think everybody wants to be walking around saying that, do they?
Absolutely not.
Okay, then. You're welcome.
Thank you for setting us all straight on the Churchosity podcast. That's
exactly what
Andy.
I'm doing here.
Well, okay. Well, then I have to just say that if everybody in America has been going out for Italian and ordering a plate of pasta that sounds like male genitalia, that is definitely proof that we are, in fact, living in the last days.
Indeed. And that's all we have to say about that.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast, the show where we try to give you the Gen X take on church culture. And thank you once again to my amazing and adorable co-host.
You're very welcome. Be sure to follow us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @ChurchosityPod. Drop us a message and give us your feedback, because we'd really love to hear from you.
And if you happen to be listening to this episode on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please just take a couple of extra seconds, scroll down a little bit farther on your phone, and give us a rating. And if you feel up to it, give us a review as well. The ratings and the reviews not only help popularize the Churchosity podcast, but they also make it a heck of a lot easier for other people to find us. And don't forget to spread the word about Churchosity Podcast by telling your friends what we're doing here.
Yeah, let them be a part of the conversation too.
But always remember that the goal of our instruction is love.
From a pure heart.
And from a good conscience.
And a sincere faith.
So we thank you all once again for listening, and we hope to catch every single one of you on the next episode of Churchosity Podcast. Peace.